This video is a bit of a chaotic one, or at least has been for me for the last few weeks. It started with the CEO witches that were posting about buying courses that could get you 6-7 figure salaries and grow your witchy business no matter what you do. And the question of, we're used to seeing this in New Age, right? Like, New Age people are like this, we understand this, it's just kind of who they are. It's part of the whole manifest destiny, think positive thoughts, what did Kellyanne call them? Trustafarians. We're used to that from that group. They can do what they want, they have the money to spend to do it. It was a bit odd to see this come out of the witchcraft side of things. And, you know, we talk a lot on this channel about where witchcraft comes from, the movements that have given it its revival in the 20th and 21st centuries, the political history of witchcraft, which is, I think, very important when you are choosing labels and how you wish to communicate your identity to other people. And so how does someone who comes from the background of witchcraft, they look at the witchcraft movement, they identify with witchcraft, how does someone from there decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sell a course on how to become a millionaire witch for, you know, €1,000 or something like that. And, you know, for the people who are falling for this offer of just the idea that a course on being a witchy CEO or a witchy small business owner can guarantee you a life of financial success as long as you believe in it hard enough. I get the temptation, like the idea of, okay, but what if I'm missing out? What if this is who I'm supposed to be? What if this is my destiny and, you know, I'm just too riddled with self-doubt to realize it and I need someone else to help me get to that point. I get why that is tempting in the everything that we are surrounded in at all times. And as we'll see through this video, kind of exploring the, you know, how these things arise, how we get there, how the idea of community seems to be breaking down as more and more strange things seem to come out of it. People behaving not as we'd expect from communities, people acting in their self-interest, people taking advantage of other people, especially vulnerable people. It's all just very kind of endemic of the everything. And I wanted to try and get to the core of why that is. Why do we make customers, in enormous air quotes? Because I'm not really sure that what's going on here really matches the definition of a customer. But why do we view the rest of our community as something that we can extract financial resources from for our own gain? Because if you are a witchy business owner selling to a witchy customer base and you're, you know, I'm going to be a millionaire from this, I am a millionaire, the money's coming from somewhere. It's kind of quite basic economics. And I don't want to go so far as to say that, you know, this is consciously malicious. I just think it's symptomatic of the world that we live in. And then I think just a few days after seeing all this thing online and deciding I wanted to do this video, the big American news event happened, which I will phrase it that way because we're still, I think, probably within the first 5 minutes of this video. But you know, from the big American news event of the last few weeks, it was very, very interesting and oh so very fun to be a trans person witnessing the fight for the narrative. And I used that word very specifically, the fight for the narrative, because it wasn't really a fight over facts. It wasn't really a desire to learn more. It was who could come up with the most credible story to hurt the other side as much as possible. You know, first of all, this is supposed to be a violent far-left Antifa actor trying to take someone out. Then once images of the person were seen on CCTV wearing an American flag, potentially they were far-right, maybe they were a Nazi. Then, you know, obviously it becomes, actually this is a false flag. Obviously this is a leftist dressed up as a right-wing person trying to sow division. Then it becomes, oh, maybe they were trans. Maybe they engraved trans messages on the bullet. Maybe they were anti-fascist. Oh, maybe they're a groyper. Maybe they're from 4chan. Bouncing back and forth with every tiny crumb of information to see who can draw the most convincing meaning from those crumbs and use it to convince other people. And I even remember seeing when the news seemed to have confirmed that the person involved's roommate was a trans woman, which I've looked into myself. I'm still not convinced by any of the evidence that seems to have been presented on that one, and it doesn't actually even matter that much. But, you know, when someone's saying something, I like to look into it. I like to check. Wouldn't it be nice if everybody did that? But, you know, it was interesting to see the number of people who kind of went, oh, they got us. Like, that's it. They won the narrative war, and now finally they've been given permission to do the things that they felt like they couldn't do before.
What did they feel they couldn't do before?
Very good question, my love. And I still haven't had that answered. I mean, there was a fair point that the second that it was just like a cis white guy, you saw them turn heel very quickly of like, oh, we need to offer forgiveness. It's what big American news event person would have wanted. And there was a similar thread drawn between this big American news event and the one in Minneapolis a few weeks ago, in which, you know, that person who did that big news event, they actually left a manifesto. I mean, it was a manifesto that was English translated to Cyrillic characters. And what was very evident from that is that there would be no coherent sense of motive that comes from it. And I think until Tyler Robinson confesses and explains outright what he did it for and why, which I do believe he is refusing to do at the moment, we just kind of have to accept that a lot of these events right now are going to be completely senseless, because in many ways we live in a senseless world. Nothing is clear-cut, nothing follows any real logic. Things just seem to be happening. We're told one thing and something else happens. We don't know who to believe. We're just kept in a constant state of confusion. And that is very much on purpose. And when things get bad, when our living standards are low, and when everything is very confusing and topsy-turvy, the need for meaning and the need for coherent stories to believe in get much stronger, which leaves us vulnerable. And I think this need for meaning and this need for stories and something to believe in is made very clear by the massive uptick in interest in things like witchcraft in the last 5 years. I think it makes sense that when a global horrifying event happens, that we feel powerless in, that we feel like we aren't control, that we feel that, I mean, you know, for someone like me, I'd always kind of felt like the world was out to get me. And this was actually a very reassuring time where it's like, aha, I was right. I told you. It's dangerous out there. You can't go out there. Bad. But, you know, once we have a big global event and we all are told to come together, to do our part, to do the right thing, take responsibility, all group together and we'll all be home for Christmas. But we are told to do it by ourselves, each individually isolated, holding the responsibility of the world on our shoulders. And we can see through things like Google Trends how much of a spike of interest there were in certain psycho-spiritual experiences. Strange Eons did a fantastic video on reality shifting, which kind of goes into this idea and actually cites a lot of the same books that I read for this video. When we're told to stay at home, when we are told repeatedly every single day that the outside world is a danger, it's no surprise that we retreated deep inside of ourselves. You know, not just materially by staying inside of our rooms or our houses, but like psychologically we retreated inside of ourselves. And you know what? The brain is a very interesting place. Lots of very interesting and surprising things can happen in there. And so, yeah, suddenly you get this huge uptick in people who are having these very meaningful, very spiritual experiences that defy common wisdom, but they feel real and they matter and they mean something to the people who are having these experiences. And I am not here to criticize that. I think that's actually wonderful. I am simply here to take a historical look at other times when things like that have happened and the ways in which that kind of situation can be taken advantage of. And there's another point in history that I can look at and I'm very aware of because I studied it in university, where there was a similar kind of hunt for meaning, a search for more than the material world was given to us. And that is the 1800s, during the Victorian era. I think what's quite interesting about this era is that we're well into the depths of the Industrial Revolution, with the idea of the factory and the workhouse is brought very much into the city. We get factory towns. People flock from the countryside, partly because industrial agriculture has rendered the number of people needed to work the land a bit more irrelevant, but also because we need people, and also, especially for some terrible reason, children, to work in these factories, in particular things like textiles, working the looms. You know, this is an era of great production, great progress, if that's the word we want to call it, towards a particular direction. You know, we have advancements in science, advancements in medicine. The world is starting to make sense in a very factual, rational, logical way. And what do people do in response? They become obsessed with the macabre, with the afterlife. If we stripped away magic, if we stripped away religion from everyday life, and suddenly the world's not so bright anymore, we're not living in God's beautiful green earth, we're living in smog and squalor. Is this it? Like, are we, is this all we have? Are we wasting our time doing this? Like, if this is all I'm going to get, is this the life that I really want to live as I'm doing it? And hey, science is improving. Science is discovering new things every day. Maybe science can prove that there is an afterlife, can prove that the spirit, the mind, the essence, the consciousness survives after death. And if I can know that, if I can know that that is a thing that comes next, then maybe this isn't so bad. I mean, this is a very Protestant idea, to be clear. You know, I've theorized for a while, but haven't been able to quite pin it in the literature, that Protestantism goes hand in hand with the witch trials and the disenchantment of the West.
We might call this general theory of religion and culture the dilution thesis. Mass culture and modern restatements of spirituality dilute traditional values worldviews. They erode serious occult belief by diluting them, thereby producing ineffective utilitarian forms of belief. The occultural dressing-up box is raided for symbols of style and attitude. The occult may even become, as is sometimes, not always, the case with astrology or Ouija board, simply fun with a supernatural edge.
Protestantism pushed things away from ritual, away from magic, and turned it into a you work hard now for the afterlife later. And we know that Protestantism helped the rise of capitalism in the world, especially through the realm of slavery.
Colonial America relied on the labor of enslaved people and indentured servants. It was very important to the colony's wealthy and enslaving class that they find a way to motivate enslaved people to work hard, despite the fact that enslaved people had nothing to gain from it. One powerful way to do so was through religious teaching and indoctrination. A productivity-obsessed form of Christianity evolved from the older, more puritanical idea that work improved moral character, and it was pushed on enslaved people. This form of Christianity taught that suffering was morally righteous and that slaves would be rewarded in heaven for being docile, agreeable, and most important, diligent. On the flip side, if an enslaved person was slothful or lazy, there was something fundamentally corrupt and wrong with them. Enslavers made it a point to keep enslaved people as busy and exhausted as possible out of fear that idle time would give them the means to revolt or riot. Even more disturbing, enslaved people who tried to run away from bondage were seen as mentally ill and suffering from runaway slave disorder. By not accepting their proper role in society, they were demonstrating that they were broken and disturbed. This worldview became the foundation for American capitalism.
But the theory that I've always wondered about is that when Henry VIII invented Protestantism, he needed to ensure its existence in opposition to Catholicism. So if you take a look at everything that Catholicism is, the symbols that it holds, the ideas that it signifies, Protestantism needs to be in opposition to that so that it can truly convert people, or at least force people to convert to something different. You need to be able to say, look at all the gold they have, look at the very fine dresses that they're wearing. You know, maybe men shouldn't wear dresses. This is what we were taught in school about it. The bishops' gowns were too fancy. Look at the gold that they have. Look at the power they hold. Look at the way that they show off in front of you. It's so extravagant. It's so vulgar. No, instead, godliness should be tied to modesty and asceticism and working hard. You know, Catholicism tells you to rest. When's it the rest? On a Saturday? On a Sunday?
On the Sunday.
Catholicism tells you to rest on a Sunday. Absolutely not. You should be working 7 days a week. That's the idea that they tried to sell. That working was a form of devotion to God. And through that, that would be what would allow you into the gates of heaven. Great way to get people to agree to work more for less so that merchants and landowners can appropriate as much wealth as possible. I mean, essentially the wealth that was going to the church, and just take it for themselves. I don't think it's a coincidence that Henry VIII is what introduces the Witchcraft Act. And the Witchcraft Act makes no distinction in it between the devil-worshipping witchcraft and the kind of magic that was performed by the cunning folk. It specifically mentions things like obtaining wealth and finding lost items and healing charms and protection. It was non-discriminatory, and I believe personally that this is because Catholicism is quite ritually and quite folksy at this point. If you compare folk traditions in, say, England with that of somewhere Catholic like Italy, or maybe in Central America, you can notice that there's a lot more rituality to the worship. People have the saints that they give offerings to. There's a lot of spellcraft, a lot of practices that we would recognize as witches, because the folk practices of those like the cunning folk were very sewn up with Christian belief. It is about petitioning saints to help you do work the way that we would petition a god or goddess or a deity. I think there's a recognition from Henry that there's a lot of this kind of wider practice and rituality around Catholicism that's just spread out among the common people. And so if you want to stamp out Catholicism, you kind of have to strip all of that away. Kind of in the opposite of the way that Christianity stole pagan stuff and incorporated it. Protestantism is like, no, gone, get out, shoo, we don't want you here. And so while I haven't directly been able to tie the witch trials to the Reformation, I have at least found mentioned the idea that the disenchantment of the West, the death warrant was signed by the Reformation.
Max Weber's influential theory of the disenchantment of the world describes a network of social and intellectual forces, the origins of which can be traced back to the Protestant Reformation. Weber's thought, which has its root in Enlightenment rationalism, claims, as does arguably much subsequent secularization theorizing, that disenchantment is a progressive unilinear process, not unlike Friedrich Nietzsche's pessimistic narrative of the West, which begins with primal myth and ends with the death of God. As Germs and Males have argued, Weber's view of disenchantment embodies an element of liberalism and of the Enlightenment philosophy that construed man's history as a unilinear progress towards moral perfection, sublimation, or towards cumulative technological rationalization.
That once you started to do that, once capitalism took hold, the magic of everyday life became quieter and quieter and quieter. And as the Enlightenment comes in and the Industrial Revolution comes in, we are left with a population of people who are crying out for some sign, some proof, some sense that there is more to this world than this. You know, I'm not surprised that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn arises from this. I'm not surprised that we get such a huge uptick in seance work and psychics and mediumship. I'm a photographer by trade. The invention of the camera as a image-making tool really shakes up the art world, because they'd been obsessed with like trying to accurately recreate reality for quite a while. And then this device comes along that can just snap, just a clean, pure snapshot of reality, or at least so we think. Just over the course of minutes, and that time is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Its ability to capture details is growing more and more. Kind of in response, the art movement rejects the photograph and says, no, it's not true art. It's just a quirk of science. And photography, in response to that, tries to emulate traditional kind of Renaissance arts. You get the pictorialists who are trying to create the kind of the heavenly scenes, the cherubs, the clouds, using wonderful, wonderful techniques, often like a combination of painting and photographic film paper to combine mediums in a way that's new and really, really exciting. And then World War I happens. I don't need to tell you about World War I. Like, it's terrible. It's horrible. The earth is torn up. Everyone's in hell. In my head, World War I is always nighttime. Like, it's always people huddling in the cold and breathing fog into their hands and trying not to light more than 2 cigarettes with 1 match. But it's cold and it's muddy and you don't know if you're going to be home. But they're saying, it's okay, lads, you'll be home for Christmas. And then it doesn't. It just keeps going on. It never ends. And if you happen to be psychologically affected by the things that you've seen, you're shot as a deserter. But it does end. That's the thing. It's a very good question. Who wins World War I? A treaty is decided. I mean, yeah, America gets involved. Germany surrenders, which I guess is the same thing as a side winning, despite the millions lives, everything. That's what I love about World War I, is that it kind of gets this like secondary effect of the narrative around World War II, where you think like, oh yeah, the Germans must have been just as evil, because that's just what Germans are like. The Germans must have been just as evil in World War I as they were in World War II. And it was a completely just war, and everyone went through hell for a good reason, and like it just isn't. It's pure horror, actual human horror. And no one really knows what to do with the world after that. There's a lot of movements that decide that we have to let go of tradition, that the old ways have failed us. If that event can happen, if something that horrible can happen, we need to completely run away in the other direction from how we were doing things. Traditionality is dead. We need to move to the future. And there are some movements that came up with some ideas for the future, and they went a certain way. And there are other movements who kind of went, one of my favorite art movements at the time is the Dadaism movement, because they looked at the horrors of World War I and went, you know what, nothing makes sense anymore. Everything is complete nonsense. It doesn't matter. We can all just do what we want. We might as well just make random noises and go da 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 da. And you get some wonderful art, you get some wonderful thick pictures. Surrealism comes out of this time. The modern art movement, really takes hold. And, I'm going to generalize very heavily here, but like part of the drive, part of the desire of the modern art movement is to find like the universal truth that's hidden at the core of everything. Like quite similar to the spiritualists, where like, if we can peel back the veil, the secrets of the universe will be revealed. And modern art tried to, condense things down to the most basic forms, find the underlying structure, see the code of the matrix kind of thing. But most people, they got swept up into the consumer boom. One of the things that happens in World War I is that all these factories get built to build munitions and vehicles and planes and engines. And we got to keep the assembly line running and running and running. We got to keep these products coming out the door. And so we need to find a way to make people buy them. And we've talked on this channel before about Edward Bernays, that he changed the marketing of goods and commodities from being around needs and things like endurance and practicality to being about desires. That, hey, wouldn't life be better if you had this? And essentially it's just a way. He was hired to find a way to keep the products coming, to keep the products selling, and to keep the buyers buying. He does all kinds of insane, evil stuff using psychoanalysis theory from his uncle Freud to try and manipulate the masses into doing what he wants, which is to spend more money. There's another group of people in this period. They're not looking to the future. They're not ignoring the past. They create an argument that, no, we should look to the past. The answers are there. We can find the known in what is known. They make the argument that, no, we should look to the past, but not to the past as we know it, to a secret, hidden past. One that was kept down by the masses. One that existed under the radar, that only functioned in the shadows, working beneath the surface, keeping things going. That if they had only been allowed to come to the surface and to preach their message to everyone else, that the horrors wouldn't have happened, that those horrors came from the forces that kept them down. You see a couple instances of this that come up in Germany, unsurprisingly. The Germans invent nationalism, or at least the most vicious form of nationalism that the world has ever seen, by constructing a false history, a false past. A story of great German knights, of heroes, and that if all we had were more of these heroes that have been hidden from us, these heroes that the bad people want to keep down, that they don't want you to know about this. If only we could be more like those heroes, if we could come together, that then the world would be a better place. We've seen how that works out. Similarly, there is a neo-pagan religion that is attempted to be formed, proposed by a man named Franz Sattler, who claimed that, basically he just drew from Gnosticism. He said that there were actually 5 gods, and there's a secret religion, a pagan religion that's existed under the radar, and that the main god of this religion has been envisioned by Christianity to be the devil. It's actually the god Adonis. That Adonis is the devil according to Christianity, but according to Adonism, the Christian god is the devil of Adonism, who has tricked the world into believing into monotheism. Whereas instead Adonism is it's a pantheistic religion. There's 5 gods. And you can see that the ideas, at least of Margaret Murray, are really starting to take hold.
The witch cult hypothesis is a discredited theory that the witch trials of the early modern period were an attempt to suppress a pagan religion that had survived the Christianization of Europe. According to its proponents, accused witches were actually followers of this alleged religion. They argued that the witch cult revolved around worshipping a horned god of fertility, and the underworld, whom Christian persecutors identified with the devil, and whose followers held nocturnal rites at the witches' Sabbath. The hypothesis received its most prominent exposition when it was adopted by British Egyptologist Margaret Murray, who presented her version of it in The Witch Cult in Western Europe, 1921, before further expounding it in books such as The God of the Witches, 1931, and her contribution to the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Although the Murrayite theory proved popular among sections of academia and the general public in the early and mid-20th century, it was never accepted by scholars of the witch trials, who publicly disproved it through in-depth research during the 1960s and 70s.
Into this idea of a secret religious underbelly that's been suppressed by Christianity, and hey, maybe it's Christianity's fault. And kind of similarly, when you look at something like Thelema,
Thelema is a Western esoteric and occult social or spiritual philosophy and a new religious movement founded in the early 1900s by Aleister Crowley, an English writer, mystic, occultist, and ceremonial magician. Central to Thelema is the concept of discovering and following one's true will, a divine and individual purpose that transcends ordinary desires. Crowley's system begins with the Book of the Law, a text he maintained was dictated to him by a non-corporeal entity named Aiwass. This work outlines key principles, including the axioms "do what thou wilt" shall be the all of the law, and "love is the law, love under will, emphasizing personal freedom and the pursuit of one's true path.
You can see this kind of idea of the environment in which these ideas are being influenced, that we want to work in opposition to and in response to the ideals of Christianity, much in the way that Protestantism was in a response to Catholicism. These new religions tend to be in response to Christian traditionalism and all of the ideas that had traditionally been held true. It makes sense why we would draw ideas from Egypt, why we would draw ideas from the East, from the Far East. I mean, there's also British colonial rule that is allowing all that to happen. And, but in particularly why we might go towards sex magic as a response to Christian abstinence, purity kind of thought. But the overarching theme of this period is that great generational trauma plus consumer boom equals fantastic ideas until the balloon pops and the depression happens.
The Great Depression was a severe global economic downturn from 1929 to 1939. The period was characterized by high rates of unemployment and poverty, drastic reductions in industrial production and international trade, and widespread bank and business failures around the world. The economic contagion began in 1929 in the United States, the largest economy in the world, with the devastating Wall Street crash of 1929, often considered the beginning of the Depression. Among the countries with the most unemployed were the US, the United Kingdom, and Germany. The Depression was preceded by a period of industrial growth and social development known as the Roaring Twenties. Much of the profit generated by the boom was invested in speculation, such as on the stock market, contributing to the growing wealth inequality. Banks were subject to minimal regulation, resulting in loose lending and widespread debt. By 1929, declining spending had led to reduction in manufacturing output and rising unemployment. Share values continued to rise until the October 1929 crash, after which the slide continued until July 1932, accompanied by a loss of confidence in the financial systems. By 1933, the U.S. unemployment rate had risen to 25%, about one-third of farmers had lost their land, and 9,000 of its 25,000 banks had gone out of business. President Herbert Hoover was unwilling to intervene heavily in the economy, and in 1930 he signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which worsened the Depression. In the 1932 presidential election, Hoover was defeated by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who from 1933 pursued a set of expansive New Deal programs seeking Keynesian economics in order to provide relief and create jobs. In Germany, which depended heavily on U.S. loans, the crisis caused unemployment to rise to nearly 30% and fueled political extremism, paving the way for Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party to rise in power in 1933.
And things aren't so great anymore. This new modernism, this new futurism isn't really working out. And the powers that be, obviously, decide to try and shift the blame where they can, where they so often do. And we get World War II. Now, I think World War II is especially interesting and relevant to what I want to convey here about meaning and how important it is. I don't talk about finding meaning in things and believing in a story to denigrate it. I talk about it because I think it is so very important. Because from World War II, we finally get to analyze people with trauma, people with PTSD, because we stopped shooting them for being deserters. Psychoanalytic theory is going strong by this point, and so they make the argument like, no, let us take a look at them, let's try to understand what's going on.
The story begins in the middle of the fierce fighting of the Second World War. As the fighting intensified, the American army was faced by an extraordinary number of mental breakdowns among its troops. 49% of all soldiers evacuated from combat were sent back because they suffered from mental problems. In desperation, the army turned to the new ideas of psychoanalysis. They made a film record of the experiment using hidden cameras.
It says here on your record that you had headaches and that you had crying spells.
Yes, sir. I believe in your profession is called nostalgia.
In other words, homesickness.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
It was induced when, shortly before the war, I received a picture of my sweetheart.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I can't continue.
That's all right.
And something from The Body Keeps the Score, which I hate that book, but this is a good point from it, highlights how when speaking to World War II veterans, those that don't suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, they think of the war in very emotional, kind of grand generalizing terms. It was a heroic victory. You know, it was winning in the face of adversity. They've given meaning to the events that happened to them. For those with PTSD, they have a much more accurate, detailed, factual recollection of events. You know, they can replay it in real time as if they were there, because that memory hasn't been incorporated into their own personal narrative. And as someone who suffers from complex PTSD, this is something that's very important to me. When I have flashbacks, they feel wrong. They feel not part of me because they don't fit in with the story that I tell myself about myself. And this is something that we all do. This is how we form ourselves. This is how we form our identities, is we create a story about ourselves that we tell to ourselves. Not to denigrate it, it's necessary. It's part of our evolution, I would go so far as to say. And when something happens that flies in the face of that challenges our view of ourselves, that's when it becomes a trauma, because we can't integrate it in with that idea of ourselves that we hold true. You know, that's our reality. This is our reality, and that event doesn't match our reality. It doesn't belong in this story. And so we push it aside and we don't process it. We don't integrate it. And so a large part of the recovery of World War II is trying to figure out what to do with the people. So many millions of human beings died in that war. And the capitalist machine has to keep on turning. How are we going to get that back together? Similarly, there's a recognition that, what the Nazis did in Germany reveals that there is a darkness inside humanity that perhaps we weren't ready to admit was there before. What do we do about that? Like, how do we keep that darkness hidden? At least in America, a large part of that answer became suburbia, the white picket fence, the nuclear family, the American dream. So the idea goes, if we can support their basic needs, we can give them housing, we can give them well-paying jobs, we can give them advertisement after advertisement selling a lifestyle, the way to be, the only true way to be a good white American man, woman, child. Just blasting imagery at people of how to live in a very kind of like new revolutionary way. This is a new idea of how to be. If we can do that, if we can sell them like, hey, if you live this idyllic life, then everything will be great and you won't need to worry about things, then we can control them. And that turned out to be quite a bit harder than we thought. We talked about it in the illegal women video. You know, the antidepressants that had to be used, the lobotomies, the rise in psychosomatic symptoms, the rise in trauma, or at least the acknowledgement of the trauma of what was happening. Like, this didn't suppress the darkness. It didn't make people more controllable. It just made the darkness more evident, but it retained it inside the family home. In the UK, on the other hand, while we get the introduction of the social safety nets, you know, we build the NHS, we still live under a period of things like rationing.
On 8 May 1945, the Second World War ended in Europe, but rationing continued for several years afterwards. Some aspects of rationing became stricter than they were during the war. In the late 1940s, the Conservative Party used and encouraged growing public anger at rationing, scarcity, controls, austerity and government bureaucracy to rally middle-class supporters and build a political comeback that won the 1951 general election. Their appeal was especially effective to housewives who faced more difficult shopping conditions after the war than during it. Rationing formally ended in 1954, with coal rationing ending in July 1958.
You know, at least in the 50s, that sense of national unity, that collective responsibility that everyone has, it keeps everything together. You know, we talk about the Blitz spirit. I mean, it's quite interesting to note that there were people during the Blitz who were like anti-blackout and were purposefully light up their houses in rebellion to being told that they should black out everything.
Note how people in Britain who refused to follow orders and turn off lights in their houses for the safety of the entire city during the Blitz might have done so for the idea of personal, individual power over themselves without care or acknowledgement for the lives of their neighbors they were putting at risk by ignoring the mandate, believing it was just an attempt to control them with overblown fear-mongering about the German attacks. By not turning off their house lights, these people were at risk of signaling to the German bombers where to strike. They also, of course, put themselves in danger, likely without understanding or believing they were doing so. Does that remind you of some people during the pandemic refusing masks and vaccines? Yeah, us too.
But, we get this idea of, hey, we're all in this together, we can all work together, we can all pull through, stiff upper lip and all that. And, a big part of getting through World War II was to honestly draw inspiration from the Nazis, to look at how they corralled an entire population with a sense of history, even if it was a false history, and give people a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. And so a large part of that comes from World War II. It's very beneficial that what the Nazis do is absolutely abhorrently evil, but it allows the Allied powers to, in response to the evil of the Nazis, hold themselves up as the good guys. Hey, don't look at the atrocities we committed. We were the good guys. I mean, they're so evil, we had to win at any cost. Don't look at the atrocities. We won. We're good. We're the saviors of the world. We saved it from the evil Nazi empire. Any cost. Don't look at how we carpet bombed Berlin with fire, which is a mostly wooden city, and then the nuclear weapon. Ignore all that. They were evil. We're the good guys. Yes, we had to do some evil. It's fine, but we're good. They can construct this narrative about themselves. So it's not really all that surprising to me that from this, we get Gerald Gardner promoting the idea of Wicca. Don't take this as me denigrating this either. I have to apologize to Wiccans. I have thought very lowly of Wicca for the entire time that I've been into witchcraft. I think that every time that I have an issue with something that I see witches doing, it tends to be something that traces back to Wicca, but it's removed out of context now. And the environment that gave birth to Wicca makes complete sense to me. Gardner comes out with this story of being initiated into a coven of witches from a surviving Dianic pagan cult, drawing on the works of Margaret Murray. We all know the story by now. And we did find one interesting account of the kind of things that Gardner was actually up to in the 1930s before the war.
Gerald and Donna Gardner attended a play in August 1938. The group responsible for the production called themselves the First Rosicrucian Theatre in England, and Gardner, with his fascination for the occult, recognized the name Rosicrucian as pertaining to a mysterious esoteric order. Intrigued with his esoteric community on his doorstep, Gardner immersed himself in the order's activities, appearing in one of its plays and attending many of its meetings. Gardner enjoyed the fact that the group provided him with the opportunity to meet with like-minded people. Although he thought that many of the order's members lacked a genuine interest in occultism, he alleged that there was a small group of friends within the society which he felt was apart from the rest. As he put it, these individuals were cheerful and optimistic and claimed to recognize Gardner from a former life, saying something along the lines of, "You belong to us in the past. Why don't you come back to us?"
But, it's counterculture time. We're in the swinging 60s. We have radio and television, television in every home and all that. This is a great way to spread the message of a new idea. Whilst the reenchantment of the West argues that during this time we start to see a steady decrease in organized religion attendance.
For 1,000 years, Christianity penetrated deeply into the lives of the people, enduring Reformation, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution by adapting to each new social and cultural context that arose. Then, really quite suddenly in 1963, something very profound ruptured the character of the nation and its people, sending organized Christianity on a downward spiral to the margins of social significance. In unprecedented numbers, the British people, since the 1960s, have stopped going to church, have allowed their church membership to lapse, have stopped marrying in church, and have neglected to baptize their children. The cycle of intergenerational renewal of Christian affiliation, a cycle which had for so many centuries tied the people however closely or loosely to the churches and to the Christian moral benchmarks, was permanently disrupted by the swinging 60s. Since then, a formerly religious people have entirely forsaken organized Christianity in a sudden plunge into a truly secular condition. The cultural upheaval of the 1960s and the associated growth of new religious and spiritual movements has presented the sociologists of religion with particularly acute problems of analysis and interpretation. Prior to this decade, the image of modern society that was most widely accepted was one in which secularization, variously conceived, was considered to be the prevailing feature, although it was recognized that this process did not proceed unevenly and could be interrupted by periods of religious revival, such as occurred in the United States in the mid-50s. The various phenomena, such as the rise of Eastern religion, the occult revival, the astrology craze, and the new Pentecostalism, which can collectively be called the new religiosity, did not, on the face of it, fit in this picture. For they did not resemble the standard pattern of religious revivals, as they were all too often in stark opposition to the churches and denominations, while at the same time it required a fairly convoluted form of argument to maintain that such movements were evidence of continuing secularization.
It's still a very Christian country. The Christian doctrine still holds very strong in the UK. But the temptation of the scandal, of the salacious news, of supposed devil worshippers meeting in the middle of the night to dance naked around a fire and worship the Lord Satan. How could the news resist? And so the word of Wicca spreads far and wide, and this beautiful story that Gardner's constructed traveled. And, from interviews with him, yes, there's a few weird moments that are a bit off-putting, but...
Dance? Well, what do you dress in when you dance?
The traditional witch's costume.
Which is what?
The skin.
In the nude?
In the nude, yes, exactly.
What stands out to me is that when I hear accounts of what Wiccans are doing in the 60s, it's for collective good. We found this interview of Gardner talking about a landlord that's causing issues for the tenants. And so they perform this ritual and bind a puppet so that to make him unable to speak for himself in defense of what he's doing in this court case. And suddenly he just drops everything. And that's amazing. He tells this story of the coven of witches that he's with, and they create this cone of energy and they use it to try and deflect the German warplanes coming over during the Blitz. That's fantastic. That's what we need more of. Because the big problem that we have now is that so much of witchcraft, at least the widely disseminated ideas of witchcraft, are about self-interest rather than collective good. How did we get there? Where I started before doing this research was the idea that, and I've mentioned this in the previous video, perhaps in the Divine Transfeminine, that, the cunning folk, the services that they offered were services for the community, for the village. The protection charms, the healing charms, the prayers to heal the cow. This is in contrast with the ceremonial magic of the Hermetic orders of the Renaissance magicians. They were very kind of upper class and kind of in a sciencey, alchemical, astrological side of things, while the cunning folk are folksy and more witchy, even if they weren't necessarily the ones being accused of witchcraft, but they were included in the Witchcraft Act while the work of the magicians wasn't. And so I kind of existed under the assumption that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Thelema and Wicca, because of all the elements of ceremonial magic that were included in this, that they would be all about self-growth, self-development, personal journey, personal discovery, and not be about this kind of greater community care. And that's just not really the case. Thelema, drawing inspiration from things like the Freemasons, has a very tight-knit community, perhaps functioning in the community's interests as opposed to the greater world's. But still, it's a community itself. Same with Wicca, you have initiation into the coven. It's small community, very close community, all with the same goal, with the same aim, with the same drive to what they're doing. And if you compare this with the atomization of the family in the 50s, and then moving into the idea of the individual in the 80s, the research that I've done, I think Thelema and Wicca did a great job of finding meaning in the face of that. Everything else is telling you to be self-interested, to atomize yourself, to wall yourself in to a single unit, get a family or die alone. And instead, these groups come together, and the work that they do, Wicca is potentially historically more focused on helping those in need, but in a quite ritualistic way. While, Thelema's ideas of do what thou will and finding your true will can come off as, to an outsider, it can sound as if it's just like, oh, well, do whatever you want, and under the will of the law, that's completely fine as far as this religion goes. But no, there are protections built into the structure of the community to make sure that someone isn't just letting their ego run wild. I didn't give these groups enough credit. That they were doing community. They're doing the thing that Isha and I have been harping on about for the longest time. Witchcraft community is the opposite of capitalism. But in the 80s, we get Thatcher. In the 70s, we get a blast of financial hardship. We get the Gulf oil crisis that sends massive inflation throughout the world. Industry suffers, workers suffer, everyone's everyday life suffers. We end up with rolling blackouts because the coal miners are striking their working conditions and the pay that they're being given. But in the face of inflation, the mine owners can't really afford to match up to it. Everyone's struggling and resentment is growing. And what Thatcher decides to do when she's down in the polls is to blame it on the immigrants.
World in Action asks Conservative leader Margaret Thatcher about immigration, unemployment, pay policy, and about her future relations with Edward Heath and Enoch Powell.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers. That's one thing that's driving some people to the National Front. They don't agree with the objectives of the National Front, but they say that at least they're talking about some of the problems. Now, we, the big political parties, if we don't want people to go to extremes, and I don't, we ourselves must talk about this problem, and we must show that we're prepared to deal with it.
Once people are bitter, when they're angry, when they feel like there's no way out, and no one is listening to them, Thatcher comes out and says, hey, I care about you, and I'm going to hurt these people because I care about you. And when it feels like nothing is going to happen, unfortunately, people kind of fall to it. What's interesting about the Thatcher election is that the working class vote in a Conservative government. This baffled everyone. This has never really happened before. The political parties were very much class-based. You had Labour for the working class, the Conservatives for the ruling class. But when everyone's struggling, when everyone is suffering, when people are afraid of what's going to happen, of where they're going to get their next meal, it's very easy to get them to vote against their self-interest by playing on their fears and their desire for change, for something to be done, anything to be done. And so she's able to sweep people up into this. And part of that sweeping people up is to play on people's values rather than their identity. So you can say that fairness is a value that people hold. They like things to be fair. They like to know that they're treated the same as other people. They don't like the idea of other people cheating. Particularly, they dislike unfairness, and they're afraid of other people taking advantage of their good nature. This is very easy to play on. If you go after people's values like that, you can reinterpret that value of fairness in lots of different ways. You can get people to believe what is fair if you can create a convincing enough story about it. And so Thatcher's able to say, you know what, it's really unfair that immigrants are coming into this country and they're taking your jobs, the jobs that you as a British person should have. Tugs at that sense of value, even if what Thatcher is then doing to industry, what she's doing to the working class, is completely against their self-interest. By tugging on those values, she's playing on something else. She's doing the same thing as Bernays did in the 20s and the 30s by getting people to focus on desires instead of needs. And in doing that, she breaks up the class structure. Like, there is no class solidarity anymore. I mean, there is between the ruling class. But, you know, she breaks up the working class, and she uses her position to weaken the working class. She breaks up the unions. She makes sympathy strikes illegal. She strips as many powers as she possibly can and makes the economy worse and worse and worse until industry after industry collapses, so the working class gets so completely decimated.
I think we have gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it. Or, I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first.
And yet, she still wins 2 more elections. Honestly, masterwork. And along with this mass individualization, the classic adage, we don't live in a society, there are only individuals and families. Along with this individuality, but still running on that disenchantment of the West, something fascinating happens in the town of Kendal in England. This is a town that prides itself on the town that the 60s never came to. There was no counterculture. There is just good conservative English values in this town. And what happens is that Eastern philosophical ideas start to show up. The New Age arrives. Yoga classes, group meditations, one-on-one meditation sessions, Reiki healing, all of these suddenly like new radical ideas start to appear and become very, very popular.
Paul Hillas et al. Conducted research into the rise of New Age movement within the rural community of Kendal in the Lake District. This is known as the Kendal Project. Kendal was selected as church attendance was double the national average, showing that religion was still relevant in the area. The conclusions of the project were that, although traditional church attendance was still the dominant religious experience, they claimed that New Age movements reflected the self-interested nature of our society and therefore are more relevant to the contemporary individual. Bearing in mind the history of Kendal, this is significant. I suspect that the first impressions visitors have of Kendal suggest a small, conservative, traditional market town, for this is what it is. I was not surprised to learn, for example, that one resident commented that he was not touched by the 60s. As such, any changes in Kendal of an alternative nature are particularly significant. The Lancaster team discovered that, over the last 30 to 40 years, the picture of the presence of the holistic milieu which emerges is one of growth, from a virtual absence of involvement in 1970 to 600 in a typical week in 2001. Indeed, it grew by around 300% during the 1990s.
Something that I haven't really mentioned, but something important that happens in the 70s is something called Erhard Seminar Training, or EST.
Erhard Seminar Training Incorporated, marketed as EST, was an organization founded by Werner Erhard in 1971 that offered a 2-weekend, 6-day, 60 hours course, known officially as the EST Standard Training. The purpose of the training was to use concepts loosely based on Zen Buddhism for self-improvement. The seminar aimed to transform one's ability to experience living to affect situations one had been trying to change. As EST grew, so did criticism. Various critics accused EST of mind control or of forming an authoritarian army. Some labeled it a cult.
And EST basically bastardizes the ideals of Zen Buddhism for self-improvement. and uses it to sell the idea of the self-directed self, the true individual. It purports to strip away layer after layer of societal expectation until you get to the core of who you are. And when you get there, you realize that there's nothing there. And from nothingness is complete freedom. You can be whatever you want.
The real point to the S training was to go down through layer after layer after layer after layer until you got to the last layer and peeled it off, where the recognition was that it's really all meaningless and empty. Now, that's existentialism's endpoint. S went a step further in that people began to recognize that it was not only meaningless and empty, but it was empty and meaningless that it was empty and meaningless. And in that, there's an enormous freedom. All the constrictions, all of the rules you've placed on yourself are gone. And what you're left with is nothing. And nothing is an extraordinarily powerful place to stand, because it is only from nothing that you can create. And from this nothing, people were able to invent a life, and allowing them to create themselves.
Invent themselves.
Invent themselves. You can be what you want to be.
I want you to start to make that sound, and on that sound, create and people the world the way you want to create it.
What Erhard did was to say that only the individual matters, that there is no societal concern, that you living a fulfilled life is all you need be concerned about. Est people came out of those trainings feeling that it wasn't selfish to think about yourself, it was your highest duty.
Something really fascinating that happens with this is that a lot of the big names in the new left, in the civil rights movements from the 60s, did EST training. And at the end of it, they say for themselves.
I was willing to die, and I had a martyr complex in a sense. I think we all did. And I've given up that ideal of sacrifice. And I'm not as overwhelmingly moved by injustice as I was. And now we reincarnated ourselves from within.
Basically, the politics were lost and totally replaced by this lifestyle, and then the desire to become deeper and deeper into the self. By now, a grandiose sense of the self. And my a good friend and one of the original Yippie founders, Jerry Rubin, definitely moved in that direction. And I think he was beginning to buy into the notion that he could be happy and fully self-developed on his own.
If you actually deeply look into Eastern philosophies, there's so much there. There's so much wisdom. The journeys that people go on, the devotions, people devote their entire lives to enlightenment and discovery. And yet, because we are the West and it's what we do, we have the goal to cherry pick and choose the bits that we like the idea of and just implant them into our Western, very capitalist, very self-interested society. And so the Yippies, as the new left were called, become the Yuppies of the 80s.
Yuppie, short for Young Urban Professional or Young Upwardly Mobile Professional, is a term coined in the early 1980s for a young professional person working in a city. The term gained currency in the United States in March 1983, when a syndicated newspaper columnist, Bob Greene, published a story about a business networking group founded in 1982 by the former radical leader Jerry Rubin, formerly of the Youth International Party, whose members were called Yippies. Green said he had heard people at the networking group joke that Rubin had gone from being a Yippie to being a Yuppie. By the mid to late 1980s, when a Yuppie backlash developed due to concerns over issues such as gentrification, some writers began using the term pejoratively.
You know, the stockbrokers, the people who are just out to make as much money as possible, like enterprise is everything. Make money now, keep growing your business, growth, 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 growth. Landmark Worldwide, known as Landmark Education before 2013, or simply Landmark, is an American employee-owned for-profit company that offers personal development programs, with their most known being the Landmark Forum. It is one of several large group awareness training programs. Several sociologists and scholars of religion have classified Landmark as a new religious movement, NRM, while others have called it a self-religion, a corporate religion, and a religio-spiritual corporation. As part of the Human Potential movement, which was centered in San Francisco, Werner Erhard created and ran the EST, Erhard Seminars Training System, from 1971 to 1984, which promoted the idea that individuals are empowered when they take personal responsibility for all events in their lives, both good and bad. In 1985, Erhard modified EST to be gentler and more business-oriented, and renamed it the Landmark Forum. Chip Wilson, the founder of Lululemon Athletica, is a follower of Landmark's principles and has directed his companies to pay for employees to attend Landmark's classes. Erhard promoted the idea that all events, good and bad, of an individual's life were of their own making, and that individuals would be empowered when they take personal responsibility for all events in their lives, an idea based in the Human Potential movement. Many individuals liked this belief, whether or not it is true, or simply works as a placebo. Various ideas are proposed for consideration and explored during the course. These include: there can be a big difference between the facts and events in a person's life and the meaning, interpretation, and significance the person gives to or makes up about those events. The course proposes that people frequently conflate facts with their own interpretations of what occurred, and as a result, create self-inflicted suffering and a loss of effectiveness in their lives. Meaning is a function of language, something people make up, rather than something intrinsic to life or occurrences. By articulating differently in a given context, people can alter the meaning they create and experience a greater degree of effectiveness in how they deal with events. In learning to perceive self-created meaning, people begin to see that the assumptions they have made about who they are in life are actually shaped by limitations they have made up in response to past circumstances or events. This realization allows participants to articulate new meanings that are free of self-imposed constraints. And marketing, in consumer capitalism, the marketing people need to figure out what to do with all these self-directed, initiated, driven people who are actualizing and becoming who they were always meant to be. What do you sell these people? They've got all this money. There must be something we can sell them. And so capitalism does, as capitalism is, and comes up with a new way. We've got all these new individuals. There's no real sense that ties them together. It doesn't match over age, it doesn't match over gender, it doesn't match over class. They can be from any background, but they all have this same drive to individuality, and we're used to assembly lines and making the same thing. So how can we sell to them? And so comes forth the idea of self-expression.
We identified that there was this trend towards what might be called individualism, where people wanted to still be part of a crowd, but to express themselves as individuals within it, to have their own personalities, to be, I suppose, their own men.
I didn't want to be the same as everybody else. I wanted it to be a little bit different, a little bit individual.
It's quite individual upstairs. It's not remarkable, but I think it's quite individual.
It is expensive.
It's Italian.
It's Italian, it's expensive, and it's good quality.
A little bit different.
Yeah, we want to set our own standards, so nobody else has got what we've got.
We just didn't want it
be the same as everybody else.
We just want to be different.
That you can express your individuality. You can see this massively in the counterculture, in metal music, in the new romantics, in goth, in pop, in new wave, old wave. You can buy new fashion, you can buy new styles, you can buy new makeup and express who you truly are as an individual.
But if life is only pain, then what's the point of living? just to make life more miserable for the conformists. Alright, so how do I join you?
If you want to be one of the nonconformists, all you have to do is dress just like us and listen to the same music we do.
Okay.
And Reenchantment of the West argues that this same phenomenon happens with spirituality. That suddenly you can, this idea of taking a step back from your beliefs, like, you can still be Christian and incorporate Eastern ideas. It's not a heresy anymore. The world's religions are your buffet table, and very much like a shitty English multicultural buffet where all of the dishes are tailored towards the palate of the English person who's eating there. They're all weak imitations that vaguely point towards ideas of Easternism. And we're able to just pick and choose and fill our plates and create a purely curated spiritual bricolage for ourselves. And the New Age practices take full advantage of this, as they had in the 60s in the counterculture there. And this is in contrast to one of the last bastions of collective agency that we have through Dianic Wicca that idolizes the feminine and worships the goddess more than the god. There are still people trying to invent stories and meanings and ways to bring people together. And then in 1988, Scott Cunningham writes Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner.
Scott Douglas Cunningham was a popular Wiccan author of more than 30 books on both fiction and non-fiction topics. More than 15 of his books were written on Wicca and its related subjects. Scott was a key player in opening Wicca to solitary practice, and by making a great deal of information available to the public, he helped influence many newcomers entering the craft. His books on Wicca led to a steady rise in its popularity, and he soon became one of the best-read Wiccan authors of his time. Sales of his most popular book, Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, Llewellyn, 1988, reached over 400,000 copies by the year 2000. His prominence was instrumental in influencing the changes that took place in the Wicca movement during the 80s. Due to his influence, the Wiccan religion shifted primarily from the hands of initiates into the public arena, and many eclectic traditions were formed as a result.
And this really starts the trend in the wider esoteric magical community of individualizing your practice, of atomizing it. It democratizes the ideas. You don't have to be initiated. You don't have to know a coven. You can practice in the comfort of your own home. You have the entire world to draw inspiration from and pull ideas from, to curate this completely tailored belief system for yourselves. And Reenchantment of the West, I love it because it's so hopeful for this. It sees this as a really good thing. That the old structures are gone, that we don't have to give ourselves over to a wider system or a hierarchy to find meaning in things. We can all find the meaning for ourselves. Isn't that beautiful? I'd love for volume 3 of this to come out, that we can reflect on some of these supposed positives. Fair play, one of the big revelations that I got from researching this, suddenly it makes so much sense to me. One of the biggest arguments I think we still have on this channel and people who watch the videos is around the idea of cultural appropriation. And I can totally see where, I thought it was just like a white colonialist idea of the world is for us because we are the West and we are the powerful and we can just take as what we want and that's completely fine. But no, it draws from these bastardizations of Eastern ideas. In Buddhism, if you give up your material world and dedicate yourself towards enlightenment, true enlightenment is to realize and feel connected to everything, to recognize the oneness of the entire world, to see the spirituality in everything, that everything's connected. But removed from that journey, it becomes everything is for everyone. And so you can pick and choose and take and grab from wherever you want, and never mind the history behind certain practices and those that have been punished for their beliefs and punished for their practices and persecuted, only to have then their persecutors take the very thing that they were persecuted for and wear it as a costume, as a form of self-expression of their beliefs. I get it. I see how you got there. I still think it's wrong, but I see how you got there. And, as a critical thinking witch, as someone who loves to analyze the world and the social structures and the trends and the interpersonal relationships that we all have to the world around us, the atomized, democratized state that we live in, it can be difficult to be critical of certain movements. Like, I can take issue with the divine feminine and issue with the false history of Wicca and critique that, but that's not representative in any way of what Wiccans are now. Wiccans can be anything. Wiccans can believe in anything because it's been atomized and spread out in this way. New Age practices that I can be very critical of, say, the Trustafarians, those ideas are now showing up in other places. It's all being very spread out. Everything's being very diffused. It's getting smeared into a way that honestly is becoming almost meaningless. When we live in a world where demographics mean nothing and class means nothing, gay people can be transphobic, trans people can be transphobic, working class people can be just as racist as the ruling class people, but that's not representative of the working class, and you shouldn't view all working class people as being racist and stupid because that's classist. Like, it's really confusing to keep on top of things because we are all just desperately clambering for any branch to hold on to that helps us make sense of the world that we live in. And in a world where nothing makes sense and everything is difficult and we're all struggling, we feel completely powerless and out of control, I think we need to be really, really wary and beware those that are offering quick solutions, that are calling to the past, that are reinvoking the specters of history. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme sometimes, and we should be incredibly careful when it does. And we should pay attention when it does. Like, there's nothing I can't stand more than those that say that politics is low vibrational or something that this shouldn't be concerned with because of it affects everything. It is everything. We've gone over this. It's impossible to identify where these problems are really coming from because they just start to sprout out of nowhere. You don't know where it's going to come from. I mean, again, the idea of a witchy CEO making 7 figures from the witchcraft community, it's absurd. But it's a thing that's happened, and it's also a thing that completely makes sense. Like I said, I started this video thinking that I was going to make a distinction between ceremonial magic as something for personal development and witchy folk magic as something for social help and support and development, the wider community senses. And what I found is actually the opposite. Like, those combinations of the two really were combinations of the two. These organizations that use a mixture of Eastern principles and ceremonial magic and folk practices, but keep the close-knit community together, they're not necessarily just going for self-interest. The self-interest comes later. It comes with the democratization of everything and the individualization of everyone. This is something that breaks class divisions. And so where do we find solidarity? This is something that breaks class divisions. And it wasn't until I read Benabel Wen's, because Benabel Wen, always to the savior. If you have any question about anything witchcraft related, probably Benabel Wen has the answer. But she highlights this point about how when you look at the distinctions between high magic and low magic, there's not really that many distinctions to be found. There's so much overlap. But essentially it's traditionally been a class issue. But now class doesn't mean anything because anyone can be anything. And I'm a postmodernist. I am someone who loves to deconstruct constructs, social constructs. But I think postmodernism gets a bad rap for being something that devalues meaning, that strips away meaning, because it points out the falsehood underneath it. But as I said at the beginning, that's not what my aim is here. My aim isn't to say that your personal practice is meaningless because you've drawn it from so many different places. Through eclecticism, you've curated your own personal belief system that's totally atomized and defined specifically for you. My only point is to ask, are you really finding meaning from that? Because I believe if you don't find meaning, if you leave yourself alone and isolated, expressing yourself, and because that's the thing, being part of a subculture, because that's the thing, right? So the internet was seen as this great thing, this great technology that would connect us all together, that people from around the world would find other people like them and they'd know that they're not alone. However, when you look at the material reality of what being on the internet is like, it's this. You know, I'm not actually talking to you right now. I'm talking alone in my house, looking at my phone. And when I write online, I'm not speaking to people. I'm not really connecting with them. I'm by myself, or with Isha, but you know, it's a false connection. It's soothing, it's better than nothing, but it's not the same as real, emotional, meaningful connection. And as we find ourselves more isolated and more alone, and technology is isolating us more and more by reflecting ourselves back at ourselves so that we feel seen the way that Narcissus felt seen when he saw himself in the pond. As AI regurgitates our own words back at us and affirms everything that we believe in and just pushes us deeper and deeper into ourselves. I think we deserve more than that. I think we deserve something more meaningful. I think we need to find the stories that make sense to us. We need to write the stories that make sense to us. To not just be about self-expression, but about self-actualization. And you know, they say that self-actualization, first you must cover the physical and the emotional needs, and then you can self-actualize. Well, then we need to group up together. We need that collective action. We need to work together to support each other so that our basic needs are met. And I want to end this on a positive note. In this world where nothing makes sense and everyone's surprising and everyone's disappointing and everything's a shame, I want to end it on hope for the future, because that's what's missing, is a look to the future. I want to see a world where we organize politically and we use witchcraft to align our intentions together so that we can achieve the same outcome, that we can do the magical work and then use that to empower our material actions to make real change. I want to see a world where we care about each other, where we truly actually empathize with each other instead of focusing on our own self-interest and our own self-protection at all costs. I don't think that we should give up on individuality. I don't think we should give up on individual self-expression, because I feel like it's really ingrained in us right now. Like, this is what has wired our brains, is what we've grown up on. But I think we can still turn that into holding hands with each other, create new covens, introduce mystical ideas into your group. You know, everyone's doing them anyway. I think if we're all just a bit more open about it and less ashamed of the things that we do in the confines of our own home, I think we can find so much more connection of belief. You know, something that's always amazed me, the people that I've met who believe in magic are the last people that I would have thought. You know, the people that, as a queer goth kid, I was terrified of as a teenager and never wanted to hang out with. But, you know, I go to group meditation sessions and I see these people there and I think that's amazing that actually this kind of breakdown of class, this breakdown of demographic, that we can all unify around these beliefs. But we actually need to unify around something. And then, yep, that's all I want to suggest here, is ask, is your practice working towards something more than yourself? Are there people you could be connecting with? Is there more that we can all do together if we just opened ourselves up to each other? I hope this surprisingly long video has been useful, and I'll see you in the next one.